We are in what many describe as a post-Christian period in this nation. So how do we still freely live out our faith and convictions in a culture that is often going in a completely different direction? Well, one of the people on the front lines of this intersection of faith and culture is my next guest, Executive Director and General Counsel for Christian Legal Fellowship, Derek Ross. Derek, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for inviting me, Cheryl.
It's great to have you here. And, you know, your organization is so often at that intersection of faith and culture where we're going in opposite directions. What are some of the cases and issues that you're speaking into right now?
Well, there's so many opportunities and spaces where we think it's really important that there be a Christian voice, not to necessarily enforce or impose our beliefs, but to be a voice at the table, collaborating with others, and contributing to these conversations of what does it mean to be a free and democratic society? What does justice require? And that's a big part of what we're trying to do. So some of the cases we're involved in pertain to things like our fundamental freedoms, freedom of religion and conscience, freedom of expression. But also we're engaged in issues relating to equality and human dignity and really wanting to promote and uphold the inherent worth of every person who we believe and know is created in the image of God.
Wow, and it seems like a little bit like a David versus Goliath fight right now, because some of the things that are happening in culture seem to be going against democracy and freedom of religion. Is that what you're seeing?
Well, certainly there's challenges and tensions. And I think anytime religion or religious expression is seen as conflicting with other commitments that other people in a society have, there's always going to be that tension and that challenge. But part of the beauty and challenge of being in a pluralistic society like Canada is figuring out how to navigate those things. How can we collectively come together, even a group of people that have very fundamentally different beliefs and understandings, but how do we live in the same real estate and not just coexist, but contribute to one another's welfare and try to find space where even though we disagree, we can still respectfully disagree in a way that allows people to flourish and find those areas of common ground. And those are some of the issues that we try to explore and advance.
And so how are you doing? Like, do you feel like you're making some headway? Is it, you know, you're having some successes in these conversations? For
sure. And I think it's a mixed response to that question, Cheryl. There are certainly cases where we feel society and people in society are losing their appreciation or the way they value religion. And so there's a lot of work that I think we need to do to remind people of the good that Christianity and other faith communities bring to society and why it's important to allow people to openly identify with their faith and for faith communities to contribute to the flourishing of society. But I also think that there's some great opportunities. I think now as much as ever, people are wanting a message of hope and a message of meaning and searching for truths beyond the here and now. And so that creates, I think, some great conversation points. So we do that both through dialogue and discourse in the legal academy and in the law schools, but we're also involved in public policy consultations and discussions. So we participate when Parliament is considering an issue. We're often given an opportunity to contribute with written or oral submissions. And we also intervene in the courts. We're very blessed to have the opportunity as an association of lawyers to be invited to act as a friend of the court, really, as an intervener that is able to come into cases and not necessarily pick a side per se, but to help the court understand some of the broader issues that might be at play in a given dispute.
I think it's so wonderful that you're in that space, and I think sometimes there is a sense that people of faith have that there's maybe a hostility in the legal system toward people of faith, particularly Christians. Do you find that, and how do you stay encouraged? How do you stay motivated?
Well, I think like every other sphere of society, you know, there in law, there are those that might be suspicious towards religion or have concerns about open expressions of faith. And our experience has been to try to build relationships with people and try to help them overcome whatever negative perceptions they might have. It might be informed by a negative experience that they had. It might be informed by just negative stereotypes or caricatures that we see perpetuated about Christians or about other people of faith. And so trying to just change that perception just by being in relationship with them and building that relationship, being present. And we think it's so important that we are visible and faithfully present in these in spaces like law. But we're also engaged in advocacy on issues like that. So one of the cases that we're involved in right now involves a constitutional challenge to a law in Quebec which prohibits people from wearing any type of symbol that identifies them with their faith, any religious symbol that can be associated with one's religion. So that applies only to people in the public sector, but that's a pretty broad category of people that it applies to in public service. So school teachers, for example, a Muslim school teacher cannot wear a hijab. A Jewish police officer could not wear a kippah, or a lawyer that works for the government cannot wear a crucifix, for example, or a cross. And so that prohibition on religious symbols, we're concerned that that's really rooted in a sentiment that views religion as something that needs to be hidden or suppressed, or even views religion negatively. And so we think it's really important for our governments to understand that people of faith contribute to the public service, not despite their religion, but sometimes because of it. Because their faith is what motivates them to serve others. And so we've had the privilege of partnering with other advocacy organizations, including those from other faith communities, to advocate in that case and others like it for the right of every person, of every faith and of no faith, to participate equally in our public institutions.
I've seen so many studies come out just about what people of faith contribute to culture, contribute to the disadvantaged, to those who are suffering. And I think that we need to publicize that more and talk about it. There was a foreign correspondent years ago who came to faith because he said everywhere he went in the world, no matter how remote it was or what war was going on or anything, there'd be a Christian with a cup of tea coming out of the bush, and they're like, why are these Christians everywhere? But that's, they're serving all over the world, and I love it. And, your journey to faith hasn't been easy. You're brought up in the faith, but it wasn't just, and I think that's why it makes you such a great advocate. Talk to me a little bit about how you came to believe in Jesus.
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, like you said, I was very fortunate to grow up in a home where Jesus was always a name that I heard, but was also so much more than just a name. He was someone that was so present in my parents' lives and in their commitments. They really tried to and continue to aspire to follow his teachings in an exemplary way. But like everyone, my faith had to be something that was my own and not just something I sort of borrowed or inherited from my parents. And so that has been a journey and sort of been a number of milestones along that journey for me. A big part of it for me has been somewhat intellectual in coming to faith. And for some people, they might think that seems kind of odd, this idea that we can come to faith through reason. But I really believe that God has endowed us with our capacity to reason and wants us to critically ask questions and to examine things and to challenge things. Even things that people might think they're not allowed to challenge in the faith. And it's really important that we have those conversations. But for me, it was really a matter of just looking at the world around me. And the more I learned about the world and its complexities and intricacies and beauties, it just became more and more difficult, if not impossible for me, to deny that there was something more, that there was a source to this beauty and goodness. And not just in a scientific or biological way, but just our capacity to reason, our capacity to love. Like, where does love come from? Any parent that's held their child or anyone that's sort of experienced the beauty of love, we know that like it just can't be random. It can't just be by chance. And so that really pointed me to thinking more deeply about where does this come from? What is the source of our love? And another really transformational experience for me was when I was very young. When I was, we were chatting about this earlier, when my mother was involved in a very serious car accident, and she was run over by a car, and by all accounts should not have survived, and was not expected to survive. And at the time, my father tried really hard to shelter me from what was going on, but I knew it was very, very serious. But at that time, I just had this sense of peace that I couldn't explain then and can't explain now. But the Bible talks about this idea of a peace that passes understanding. This sense that even though things aren't okay, and I shouldn't think that things are going to be okay, I still have a sense that they're going to be okay. And thankfully, miraculously, my mother experienced a full recovery and is doing amazingly now. I continue to lean on her every day. to this day. But the point of that story isn't necessarily to highlight the happy ending, because a lot of stories don't have a happy ending. But the reality that there are things that we can't explain in the here and now that force us to think of what transcends all of this, and this idea that we need to rely on something beyond ourselves. And those were all things that pointed me towards God and starting to embrace the Christian faith as my own.
I absolutely love your journey, and I'm thinking of somebody watching this interview who maybe doesn't relate to Christians who have more of that experiential faith, or are explaining a mystical experience that they themselves have never had. So how would you talk to somebody who's kind of like, I'm not really sure about this faith thing. You seem like a bright guy. What encouragement could you give them on a spiritual journey if they're probably more of the intellectual, type?
Yeah. Well, I certainly don't profess to be an expert in that area, but I would just share my own experience and my own journey and ask them questions like, do you think this is all there is to our existence? And point to things like our capacity to reason, or our inner conscience, that voice that we all have that helps us discern right from wrong. We might not always all agree on what is right and what is wrong, but we all still have that sense of there is a difference between right and wrong. And so I'd ask, where do you think that comes from? Is that just sort of a thing that has randomly developed, or is there a source? Is there a lawgiver, a moral lawgiver that helps us discern what is right and wrong? Some of the work that we do at Christian Legal Fellowship, obviously, is in advocating for human rights. And so that would be another question I would point to is, where do you think, if you believe in human rights, and almost everyone does, I would ask them, where does that come from? Is our commitment to one another, is that just something that we give each other? Is it just something that relies on the stroke of a legislator's pen? Or is there something transcendent that, regardless of what the government of the day thinks, or what the majority of a population votes on, are there certain truths that we would say, those don't disappear, that murder is always wrong, that slavery is always evil? Where do we get this sense of right and wrong? And I think that ultimately, someone that is wanting to be intellectually curious and intellectually honest, we all have to wrestle with those questions.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. I often think when I see a parent lay down their life for a child, like willing to do that, most parents would. And, God laid down his son for our lives. And the Bible says we're all made in his image, whether we acknowledge it or know it or not. And when I see people do tremendous acts of love, even when they don't acknowledge God, I think, oh, you're just like your dad. You don't even know, but you're just like your dad. I've just loved this conversation. I could ask you so much more, but thank you so much for dropping by. And thank you for the work that you're doing on behalf of freedom for so many people of faith.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me, Cheryl.